welcome to everybody this morning. Thanks for joining our webinar. Today's webinar is around the good behind great estimating. And as I mentioned before, we've got quite a few people joining us. A large mixture will be the Agency Works clients. Some of you, though, might not know who we are. So before we start, just a quick introduction. My name is Steve Vincent. Nice picture of me on the screen there from the races we went to. I am one of the co-founders of the Agency Works. I've been working with agencies for probably over 20 years now, helping them kind of improve processes, become more efficient and hopefully more profitable. And joining me on today's session is my colleague Kate, who has previously worked at a number of B2B agencies before seeing the light and jumping ship and coming to join us at the Agency Works a couple of years ago, Kate?
It does, yes. Almost 2 years, yeah.
Brilliant. So we're going to run through today's session. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to kind of take questions because there's quite a few people on the call, but we will be providing contact details at the end of the session if you wanted to reach out. So today, why great estimating really matters within your agency, and more importantly, how getting it wrong can lead to other issues. So like not having enough time to deliver great work, or having kind of a stressed studio, or being in a situation where we're delivering work for free, which we know nobody wants. So before we start, I think it's quite key that we explain the definition of what we're looking at today. So I've seen this called a number of different things within agencies. So whether it's an estimate, a quote, a budget, a proposal, for today's session, we're talking about estimating. So an estimate for us is internal. So this could be your costing sheet, but it's basically what you think you need to deliver on the brief that you've received. So that might include estimating internal resources, resource types, it might be third-party purchases. That is different to your quote, which is an external document, which is what we send to the client and where we make those commercial decisions. Sometimes your estimate can equal your quote, but I think it's important to have the ability to amend it, because often I've seen clients who will take a client budget and reverse engineer the estimate to fit the budget. So in reality, that's not a true reflection. So it isn't about what we can charge the client, it's about what we think in reality we'll need to deliver the project. So today we'll be talking about the estimating side, not the quoting side as much. So what does that look like? So whether you're doing this in Excel, in Google Sheets, in agency management systems, then this is how we manage it. This screen may look familiar to a lot of you who are Synergist clients. So on the left-hand side, I can see here that we've got an estimate created, and I've broken the estimate down into 3 deliverables, but I've been able to accurately estimate how much time I think I need on each different type of resource to deliver each part of the project. So not only is that going to estimate for me and forecast that we might need 74 hours from a capacity point of view, it can also forecast the potential costs, and it can also recommend a figure that we perhaps should be quoting the client. Now, if you have a rate card or an agency rate card, obviously that can be driven by that. So you may be using your estimate to drive your quote fee, but that is different to obviously what we have on the right-hand side, which is more of your quote output. So this is where we can start to decide whether we are showing the client the hours, whether we want to do more of a kind of a value proposition. So we might add additional text, we might override the price, or you might have to add a discount if that's required as well. So we have an internal costing and we have an external what we're going to share with the client.
So estimating, let's nail down why it really matters and what it means for the bigger agency management picture. So we're all familiar with the horse meme that's on the screen at the moment. It's often doing the rounds on social media, and it's a good example of our client expectations and what we may have inadvertently caused ourselves. It's also a good demonstration of 2 different types of estimating. All too often we estimate with the top-down method. This involves us taking the client budget, say 10K, then carving the time up we need to deliver the job to match the client budget. A better method is to use the bottom-up method, starting by taking all the tasks required to deliver sort of the pretty picture of the horse, and then put time to each of those tasks, preferably using your charge codes, or you might call them your rate card. This will give you out a charge cost to the client. Now, you might well find that this doesn't actually meet the client budget once you've gone through this process, which then gives you that decision to either go back to the client to change the brief or to up the budget. Of course, as Steve was just pointing out just a moment ago, you might then make the commercial decision to actually discount it and charge less. And a good way to decide if that's a good decision or not is to think of 3 Fs. And that, does the work fall into one of these categories: fortune, fame, or fun? And I don't think I need to explain what each one of those means. But whatever the reason is that if you decide to sort of commercially decide to discount it, make sure that the client knows that they're getting the pretty horse picture for the price of the child's version. So there's a couple of different ways of estimating, but why does estimating matter? So the first one being your capacity forecasting. So that's sort of knowing what type of resources you'll need to deliver the brief over what period. And it gives you a more long-term version of what months the work needs to be delivered in.
Yeah, I think that capacity forecasting, you're right, I think is much more kind of longer term. But I think in terms of raising an estimate, it also benefits shorter term work allocation, because if you have done an internal estimate, then hopefully work allocation should be easier, because what we're able to do then is draw down on the original budget. So often we're approached by agencies who have an issue with work allocation or with scheduling. And often it's not the scheduling that's the issue. It's a symptom of not having a clear estimate. So if you are looking to allocate work into the team, the first thing we need to know is kind of what type of resources required, how many hours we want. And if we have that, then we can easily allocate it from that by drawing it into users' diaries and calendars. It also helps, I think, provide a guide to the team in terms of how much time they have to complete that task. Because if we just allocate them the job, then they might spend hours on something that you haven't actually allocated or managed to sell those hours for. So it'll hopefully also help you avoid over-servicing or over-scheduling.
Absolutely. And it can also help you calculate the quote. So in that, like the bottom up sort of version of the estimate that I was just speaking about a moment ago, it can help you calculate the cost by putting those charge codes to each of those tasks, and then helps you get the profit margin out of what the job's going to be. So especially if the client is paying time and materials, you can find out the value of the estimate. And then if you manage to invoice that, what will your gross and net profit be?
I think that ties in as well. You mentioned there about forecasting. If we do have those quotes, we know that most agencies have kind of standard profit margins that they're looking to achieve. So if we do have the quotes in place, which are driven from the estimates, then we're able to forecast kind of not only what revenue should come in, but also kind of what profit that will bring in as well. And that's both true on prospective new business and also on client work as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it can also help with forecasting your costs. So your third-party cost, your purchases, which can in turn help manage your cash flow, which your finance team will love you for.
Absolutely. And I think on the same vein, on the same theme, about tracking, this is key. It's about having visibility on those costs. If you are capturing time and third-party costs on a regular basis, it allows you to monitor about how you're performing against your budget, against your estimate. So those conversations around, I can see we're 50% burnt through the time, but are we really 50% through completion? If you are, then you might be in a situation where we're looking at revising quotes or revising estimates as well, because if we need to look at estimate time to complete, we can't just rely on original estimate. We may need to revise that to reflect the reality of what we need to do to deliver the project.
Absolutely. And on the screen now is that magic word, utilization. I hear this banded around quite a lot. And we've recently actually produced a case study for a company called Armstrong B2B. which, and in that case study, they've sort of said about how the accurate estimating has helped with their utilization rates. As overestimating, they saw their resources sitting around with nothing to do, whereas underestimating can leave your studio feeling stressed and burnt out.
Very true. And also finally, to finish off, I think consistency, again, this becomes really important. This kind of comes around if you have different members of the team working on the same client. So is there a consistent approach in terms of how we estimate and how we charge that client? So this comes back to kind of client management and ensuring that they're not being charged differently by different members of the team. Now, how best to do that? We see this working well if you can have almost kind of predefined job templates. So you're almost kind of, okay, not every job is the same, but if you go through the same process, the same stages, if you use the same sort of people, then it becomes almost kind of a shopping list. It's a starting point for the whole team to use in terms of how we're going to quote that client and how we're going to estimate it. Or another method may be looking at previous jobs. So about learning lessons, what worked well, what didn't work well, and then you can amend your estimate accordingly based on kind of previous projects. I think that also ties in as well with having a more consistent reporting process as well. Is that if people are using the same format and templates, then again, we've got more chance of getting more consistent reporting at the back end.
So with this in mind, how about some top tips and some best practice? So the first one on there is be clear on the scope. So be sure you're asking your client the correct questions, and don't be afraid to ask your team what questions they might be asking and what needs to be done. And if clear, don't promise. Check with your team.
Yeah, I think talking to the teams is really important, and also talking to the team about, particularly, I think we see in agencies, if an estimate comes in, rather than just kind of keeping it within client services, asking the team who are involved in the deliverables to actually kind of budget and estimate how much time they think they'll need. That gets them, I think, more sold in, or they buy into the kind of what they're delivering, and I think it makes them more accountable because they then kind of will try, I hope, to kind of deliver the work on what they've estimated originally. It will still go back to kind of client services and ADs and whoever else to make those commercial decisions, but again, you've got a better chance of getting a more accurate estimate if you involve the team in that process.
Absolutely, and ask them to consider the risks and the impacts as well. So we've got there on the screen as number 3. So ask them to consider them and then create an estimate off the back of that. So potentially you're asking them to create a pessimistic one where everything goes wrong and you've got millions of rounds of amends, but also a standard one where everything just goes to plan and it's all good and well. And then your optimistic one where you get it right first time, no amends, and approval happens immediately.
That never happens.
Yeah, it never does.
But and also as well, we've touched on this, looking at similar projects, using the data, learning from what's worked well, what hasn't worked well, and then obviously we can use that as basing our future jobs on.
Absolutely. And consider the client. Is the client particularly high maintenance? Do they always ask for extra amends? Or maybe they simply just have a lot of stakeholders that they need to consult for the approval process.
And I think that includes your senior team. And I presume most of you are doing this already, but kind of almost a kind of a sense check, running the estimate past senior members of the team. So whether that's just a kind of, as I said, a sense check, or whether you're actually kind of you are delivering the pitch. So actually having practice delivering the pitch with the senior team before we actually kind of present that to our client.
Absolutely. And clearly communicate the scope and the risks to your client. Do they need a flex budget? It's a lot easier to charge less at the end of a project rather than having to go back to the client and ask for more budget, and it keeps the client happy. But of course, we can't always get it right. But what are the realities of underestimating and how can we learn from it? First of all, we need to work out why it happened. Was the brief misunderstood? Did we estimate for a junior team member to do the work, but more experienced, expensive member pick it up? If that did happen, then don't be afraid of letting the client know what a great deal they got. Or maybe we just simply overservice the client. Whatever the reason, if you're struggling to tell the client, think of Carl Sacker's quote on the right-hand side there. Be strategically free, never secretly free. So letting the client know will enable you to charge the correct amount next time.
And another, if we lean back on agency guru, Carl Sackers, he came out with these kind of magic 7 words that we don't often hear at agencies, but we like to think usually we would recommend that you do use. If you are heading out of scope, we'd like your team, or you recommend that your team are asking the client, would you like an estimate with that? So what we're seeing is a lot of agencies continuing to deliver work or chargeable work, even if it's outside of the original scope. So I think it's about kind of working out how important those changes are if it's out of scope. If, for example, it's going to cost the client another, I don't know, 5K to deliver that, do you still want it? And it's amazing if we're going to put, or how less important these changes become if you have a price associated to it. This is going back to when we've touched on this before, but the real-time tracking. You've got a better chance of having those conversations if you can capture it live. So if we know a project's going over budget, and it's outside of scope, it's not just another amend, then we're able to go back. So it's about training your team to go back to the client and use those magic 7 words. Would you like an estimate for that? And you'll soon, or you'll hopefully start to avoid overservicing. So on the theme of avoiding over budget projects, these are other things and other tips that we would recommend. Number 1, it goes back to that classic, if a project went over budget, it can go back to the very start where we perhaps didn't understand the client brief, or they didn't actually give us the full brief that we required. So we need to gain better clarity on that brief. We need to understand. So this idea about asking why multiple times, maybe 5 times, drilling down. Do we really understand what they want? Do we know what what we're meant to deliver? Because if we don't know what we're meant to deliver, then going back to your estimate, you can't accurately estimate if you don't know. Being clear on objectives, why they're doing it, who they're targeting, what it needs to achieve. So this will help you stay objective and push back if the client becomes more subjective. Defining what's actually classed as amends and what's not. So we need to be clear on this. Is it actually amend, or is it something that's out of scope? If it's not an amend, then we go back to those 7 magic words we mentioned before. Real-time tracking, touched on before, it's that live visibility. We can't wait till a project is finished and we're doing the project wash-up and project reconciliation to decide, actually, we've spent too much time on things that weren't in scope. So actually, if you're tracking it live, you've got more chance of having those conversations. Yeah, agreeing how many rounds, how much time is being spent, but also I think it's around managing client communication. So both parties are clear on what to expect. This comes back, I think, in terms of kind of training your client in terms of how best you want feedback. So it's around, I think, consolidating stakeholder feedback into kind of, one channel. We don't want multiple stakeholders at the client side providing feedback to multiple team members. Ideally, they should be having kind of internal workshops in the first place themselves before feeding back to yourself. So it's about guiding the client on how best to gather feedback at each stage before we continue the project. Also, if you're doing this, again, documenting those changes and that feedback, if a client has decided not to go with an amend change, or you're not going to deliver a change, we need to document that, because if they come back in the future and we've not delivered that, we need to have evidence that that's what was agreed. And then finally, reviewing with team and client. So this is kind of is a post-review of what worked well and what didn't work well. And that is true for both internal feedback, but also external feedback with your client. It's also about going back to Kate's point about being strategically free. If the project did go over budget, then how might that impact future projects with them? So you need to be open, and it's being open. And it's also, I think, around educating your clients. So whether they go on to work with you or with other agencies, at least then they'll have a better idea of kind of how these things work. So they're my top tips for avoiding over budget projects. I mean, Kate, from kind of working agency side, what would you recommend be the kind of takeaways from kind of what we've covered from today?
I've got sort of three top takeaways. The first one being remembering the difference between your estimating and your quoting. So that very first point at the beginning of the webinar, Steve, where you pointed out the quote is your commercial decision and your estimate being your internal facing document to drive things like capacity. And your estimate should reflect reality. Remember that horse meme that will, what will it realistically take to deliver it, and build your estimate from that. And the last one would be real-time tracking. Keep an eye on those estimated versus actual hours, and make sure that is a clear line of communication internally. Do we need more time? And make sure you catch it before it goes out of scope.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really important. I think that kind of brings us to the end of today's session. Hopefully that was useful. It may be that a lot of you are doing all the things that we've talked about today. If you are, well done. If you're not, then hopefully there's some good tips for you. As I mentioned at the start, if we didn't manage to cover everything, or if you want to kind of explore things in more detail, do please reach out to us either on the contact pages that you can see there, on the emails you can see on the page, or via LinkedIn. We will be sending you, as I mentioned, a copy of the recording for you to share with other members of your team. We'll also be sending you a copy of the user story from Armstrong B2B agency that Kate mentioned previously around improving utilization, because that does tie in with kind of having better estimating and some of the stuff that we've covered today. We'll also send out as well some more details on our next webinar, which will be running next month, which is all to do with briefing, best practice, and pitching perfection, which isn't easy to say, but hopefully it will be an exciting session. So, yeah, all I can say is thanks ever so much for your time. I hope you found it useful. Thanks ever so much, Kate, for joining me today, and I hope you have a great day.
Cheers. Bye, guys.
Bye, guys.